The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Abigail Foster finally accepted that she could walk no farther. She sank down against the trunk of an old oak at the roadside, her dark blue dress soaked through and clinging to her trembling body, and pulled her knees up against her chest as if she could somehow make herself small enough to disappear from a world that had already taken everything from her. 6 weeks earlier she had buried her husband Thomas beneath a modest headstone in a churchyard 200 miles east, a fever having claimed him within days of the same illness that had swept through half their county. 6 weeks earlier, she had been a farmer's wife with a home, a name, and a future. Now she was a widow with nothing but a small satchel of belongings, a diminishing handful of coins, and a road that seemed to stretch endlessly into a gray and merciless horizon. She had set out from her late husband's family farm because his brother had made it clear, in the cold weeks following the funeral, that there was no place for her there any longer, not once the land and cattle had passed to him by law and by custom. She had a distant cousin, she believed, somewhere in the Wyoming Territory, a woman named Constance whom she had not seen in a decade, but who represented the only thread of family left to follow. She had sold what little she could, packed what fit into a single trunk, and set out on a journey that had, over the past month, worn down both her body and her resolve in equal measure. The stagecoach she had been traveling on had broken an axle 2 days prior in a town too small to have a proper wheelwright, and rather than wait indefinitely for repairs with her funds dwindling by the day, she had made the desperate decision to continue on foot toward the next town, trusting that some conveyance might eventually pass her on the road. Instead, the skies had opened into a storm that showed no signs of relenting, and she had walked until her legs simply refused to carry her another step. It was in this state, exhausted, freezing, and increasingly aware that a night alone in this weather might be more than her body could survive, that she heard the creak of carriage wheels and the heavy clop of hooves on the muddy road. She looked up to see a fine black carriage approaching, drawn by a pair of sturdy horses, and beside it walked a man leading them by their bridles, apparently having dismounted to guide them carefully through the worst of the mud. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in clothes of clearly expensive make despite being soaked through like everything else in this wretched storm, a dark leather vest over a white shirt gone nearly transparent with rain, and a black hat that did little to shield his face from the downpour. Abigail's first instinct was to shrink further into the shadow of the tree, wary of strange men on empty roads, but something in the way he slowed his horses and looked toward her with open concern, rather than the calculating interest she had learned to fear from certain kinds of men, made her hold still and meet his gaze instead of hiding from it. His name was Nathaniel Graves, and he was, though Abigail did not yet know it, one of the wealthiest cattlemen in 3 counties, a man who had built an empire of land and livestock through relentless work and a shrewd mind, and who was returning from a business trip to the territorial capital when the storm had caught him on the road. He was not accustomed to feeling much beyond irritation at delays of this sort, but the sight of a young woman huddled alone beneath a tree in weather fit for nothing living struck something in him that his considerable fortune had never quite managed to harden over. He approached slowly, not wanting to frighten her, and asked in a voice pitched low and even beneath the hiss of the rain whether she was hurt, whether she had people nearby, whether there was anything at all he could do. Abigail, her pride warring visibly with her exhaustion, told him she was simply resting and would continue on shortly, a lie so transparent that even she seemed to hear its hollowness as she said it. Nathaniel did not argue with her directly, understanding instinctively that a woman reduced to sitting in the mud in a rainstorm did not need to be contradicted, only offered a door she could walk through on her own terms. He simply told her that his carriage was passing through in the direction of the next town regardless, and that he would consider it a poor use of an empty seat to leave her sitting in weather like this when there was room enough for her beside him. He extended a gloved hand, not with the presumption of a man expecting gratitude, but with the plain patience of someone willing to wait as long as necessary for her to decide. Abigail looked at that outstretched hand for a long moment, weighing the last scraps of her pride against the growing numbness creeping into her fingers and toes, and finally, wordlessly, she let him help her to her feet and guide her into the dry shelter of the carriage. Inside, a small lantern swung gently from its hook, casting warm light against the rain-streaked windows, and Nathaniel produced a woolen blanket from beneath the seat, offering it to her without comment on her sodden state or the mud staining the carriage floor. She wrapped herself in it gratefully, her teeth still chattering, and for a long stretch of the journey neither of them spoke, the silence filled only by the rain drumming against the roof and the steady rhythm of hooves on the muddy road. It was Nathaniel who finally broke the quiet, asking gently where she was traveling and whether someone awaited her arrival. Abigail found herself, to her own surprise, telling him the truth rather than the guarded half-answers she had given strangers along her journey thus far. Perhaps it was exhaustion that loosened her tongue, or perhaps it was something steadier in this man's manner that made honesty feel safe rather than dangerous. She told him of Thomas, of the fever, of the brother who had made his wishes plain, of the distant cousin she was chasing across half a territory on nothing but an old address and a fading hope. Nathaniel listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he did not offer the empty condolences she had grown weary of hearing, the kind that came wrapped in pity but carried no real weight. Instead he simply said that grief was its own kind of storm, one that did not obey any schedule of decency, and that surviving it took more courage than most people ever had cause to discover in themselves. Something about the plainness of his words, free of performance, settled something in Abigail's chest that had been clenched tight since the funeral. By the time the carriage reached the outskirts of the town, the storm had not lessened, and the driver's assessment, once they stopped to inquire, was grim. The road ahead toward the address she carried was washed out in 2 places, impassable until the water receded, likely not before the following day at the earliest. Abigail's face, already pale from cold and exhaustion, drained further at this news. The town Singalin was, as her luck seemed determined to demonstrate, fully occupied by travelers stranded by the same storm. Its last room let out not 20 minutes before their arrival. She stood beneath the inn's narrow awning with her satchel and her borrowed blanket, calculating with growing despair how many hours remained before nightfall and how little daylight would help her regardless, when Nathaniel, who had gone inside to inquire further, returned with an offer that made her breath catch. His own house lay just at the edge of town, a sturdy 2-story home he kept for the seasons he spent overseeing his nearest ranch operations, and it stood presently empty but for a housekeeper who could see to her comfort. He told her plainly that he would not presume to suggest anything untoward, only that a roof and a warm fire seemed a better prospect than another night exposed to this weather, and that she was welcome to stay under his roof, with his housekeeper present the entire time, until the road cleared and she could safely continue her journey. It was Abigail who spoke the words that would linger between them for months afterward, quiet and unadorned, without artifice or coyness, simply the plain truth of a woman with nowhere else to turn. She looked up at him through the rain and said, "I need shelter for tonight," and there was such raw vulnerability in the admission, such hard-won honesty in a woman who had clearly spent her whole life being told to manage, to endure, to ask for nothing, that Nathaniel found himself moved in a way few things had moved him in years. He nodded, offered his arm, and led her to the carriage once more, and within the half-hour she found herself standing in the warm, lamplit foyer of his home, being fussed over by a kindly, no-nonsense housekeeper named Mrs. Aldridge, who took one look at her sodden state and set about drawing a hot bath and finding dry clothes before Abigail could even properly thank anyone. That first night, wrapped in a borrowed robe before a crackling fire with a bowl of stew in her hands, Abigail felt something she had not permitted herself to feel since Thomas's death. A fragile, tentative sense of safety. She did not fully trust it, having learned the hard way how quickly circumstances could turn, but she allowed herself, for one evening, to simply rest. Nathaniel kept a respectful distance, dining separately and only checking in briefly to ensure she had everything she required, and something in his careful restraint, his refusal to leverage her vulnerable position for anything beyond simple decency, told her more about his character than any amount of conversation could have. The washed-out roads, as it turned out, took considerably longer than a single day to clear, a full week passing before travel became safe again, and in that week something quietly extraordinary unfolded between two people who had each, in their own way, been shaped by loss into a careful kind of solitude. Nathaniel, Abigail learned, had lost his young wife to childbirth some years before, along with the child, and had thrown himself into building his ranching empire in the years since largely as a means of avoiding the emptiness such grief left behind. He confided this to her one evening on the porch as the last of the storm cleared into a sky scattered with stars, and Abigail understood then that his kindness toward her had not been the careless charity of a wealthy man with nothing to lose, but something offered with full knowledge of exactly what desperate grief could do to a person, and a determination that she would not have to face hers entirely alone if he could help it. Over the course of that week, Abigail found herself laughing again for the first time in months, drawn out by Nathaniel's dry wit and the genuine curiosity he showed toward her opinions, her memories of the farm she had once loved, her small dreams for whatever life might come next. She helped Mrs. Aldridge in the kitchen despite the housekeeper's protests that a guest ought not to work, finding a quiet comfort in the familiar rhythm of useful labor. Nathaniel, for his part, began finding reasons to linger near the house rather than riding out to inspect distant pastures, inventing errands that kept him within conversation's reach of a woman who, mere days before, had been a stranger huddled beneath a tree. Neither spoke aloud of what was growing between them, both too wary of grief's aftermath to trust anything that felt this immediate, but the town's few residents who observed them together during that week noted a warmth in Nathaniel Graves that none of them had seen in the 3 years since his wife's passing. When the roads finally cleared enough for safe travel, Nathaniel insisted on personally escorting Abigail the remaining distance to her cousin's address, unwilling to trust her safety to strangers after everything the storm had already put her through. They found Constance's small house at the end of a quiet lane, and the reunion between cousins, tearful and warm despite a decade's separation, gave Abigail the family welcome she had crossed the territory hoping to find. But as Nathaniel prepared to take his leave, his carriage waiting at the gate, Abigail found herself unwilling to let the moment pass without acknowledging what they had both, in their careful silence, avoided naming. She walked with him to the gate and told him, with the same plain honesty that had first moved him in the rain, that she did not know what the future held, but that she did not wish for this to be goodbye. Nathaniel, a man who had built an empire through decisive action, found himself uncharacteristically hesitant, aware of how much rested on his next words. He told her that he had no wish for it to be goodbye either, that in the space of a single storm-soaked week she had reminded him of feelings he had believed permanently buried alongside his wife, and that he would be honored, whenever she felt ready and not one moment before, to court her properly, with all the patience such a courtship deserved. Abigail, standing at her cousin's gate with the last of the storm clouds finally breaking apart to reveal a clear evening sky, felt something in her chest unclench fully for the first time since Thomas's death, and she told Nathaniel that she would like that very much. Their courtship unfolded slowly over the following months, built on letters and visits rather than haste, each of them determined not to rush past the grief that had shaped them both into more careful, more grateful versions of themselves. Nathaniel would ride the considerable distance to Constance's home every few weeks, always with some small gift that showed how closely he had listened to Abigail's passing mentions of favorite things, and Abigail found herself, with each visit, more certain that what had begun as an act of simple decency on a rain-soaked road had grown into something neither of them had expected to find again. When he finally asked her, a year to the week after that first storm, to become his wife, he did so not with grand declarations but with the same plain, steady honesty that had first drawn her trust, telling her simply that his house, his land, and his life had felt properly full only in the months since she had entered them, and that he could imagine no better way to spend whatever years remained to him than in partnership with a woman whose strength and grace had outlasted every hardship set against her. Their wedding took place on the porch of the very house where she had first been given shelter, the same fire crackling in the hearth behind them, Mrs. Aldridge weeping openly with joy as she watched the woman she had come to love like a daughter join hands with the man she had watched grieve for so many quiet years. Abigail wore a simple dress the color of the storm-washed sky that had first brought them together, and as she spoke her vows, she thought of that desperate night beneath the oak tree, certain then that her life had reached its lowest and loneliest point, never imagining that within its darkness waited the beginning of everything good that would follow. Nathaniel, watching her, understood that fortune had given him wealth and land in abundance, but that the truest richness he had ever known had arrived soaked through and shivering on a muddy road, asking for nothing more than shelter, and offering, in return, a second chance at a life he had believed was closed to him forever. If this story touched your heart, subscribe now, because the next tale of courage, resilience, and unexpected love is waiting for you.